progress. There's pretty good research on that now. For kids, anyway. You know, once you're an adult, each your own. Okay, so let's look at our business cycle. We talked about the ups and downs of the economy. This picture is not quite as fun because the ups and downs aren't quite as noticeable. But this is the actual look over a long period, so dating back to 1960. How many of these ups and downs, but specifically the downs, are the ones we care about the most? Maybe sometimes we should care about the ups as well. Have there been? So here we are in 2020. Of course, we know there was a COVID recession here. Again, by the time this is the latest edition of the textbook, but because GDP takes a while to get data on, don't have that further out than 2020. But 1960, there's a little bit of a drop here. 70, 74, 80 was the Reagan years coming off of some inflation. And then 2001 was kind of known as the dot-com bust. Have you guys heard about that a little bit, since that's a little more closer to your age range? The dot-com bust. So basically the short of the story is, technology's changing, and all the old executives heard the younger people your guys' age saying, oh, let's talk, pets.com and this.com and this.com, and so stock market prices kind of soared and then ended up collapsing, and that at least contributed somewhat to a small recession. So the reason I bring that up is that there is a difference here between the stock market ups and downs and what we've been talking about, the whole economy ups and downs, right? So when we measured the ups and downs, we're measuring GDP, real GDP, the quantity. So we filter. What does real mean again? What did we filter out?
Price changes.
Price changes, good. We filtered out inflation. So we want to keep prices and quantities separate. And so when we look at gross domestic product, nominal gross domestic product, it is the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within the nation's boundaries over the course of some time period, a year. So the nominal GDP for 22 is the prices in 22 and the quantities in 22. The point is, if we look at what happened in 23 and 24 to compare it, we don't care about the prices. So one way to think about this real quickly is, if all the prices at Walmart doubled on you, would that suck? Yes. But if all the prices doubled and your income doubled, you were making $40,000 a year and now you're making $80,000 a year, would your income doubling and the prices at Walmart doubling, would that suck? No. You can put the same amount in your shopping cart, right? So as long as resource prices and output prices, specifically your income as it pertains to you, if your income is keeping up with prices at the store, prices go up by 10%, but you get a 10% raise. Prices go up by 5%, but you get a 5% raise. You don't care, right? You're in the same purchasing power position anyway. You haven't been hurt by inflation if your income is keeping up with the price changes on the shelves. So that is why we filter out that effect. What we care about for human prosperity and human well-being is the material things here that you buy with your money. So what's happening to that over time? And so nominal GDP can also be thought of as the way to figure, to calculate the actual value at a point in time, but it changes because of prices and quantities. So real GDP is equal to nominal GDP divided by the price level. And so we've deflated, we've taken prices into account, we've sucked out the price effect and calculating now just the quantity effect. All right, so this is what we're measuring here is the quantity. So stock prices can go up and down for different reasons, like during the dot-com and other phases. The housing market is another example that was more during this 2008 recession, which was a lot more severe. The downturn here was a lot more severe. Was mostly people point towards housing market prices. So again, housing prices going up and down over time is not the economy going up and down over time, but it's part of the economy. It's a fairly large part of the economy. So these things kind of factor into the recessions and expansions of the economy, but ultimately we're looking at the overall economy when we do this analysis. Okay, questions or comments there? Yeah?
Is this a way to predict or to estimate when the next recession will come?
So yes, we'll get into that a little bit more down the road. So Tim asked, is there a way to predict it? And the short answer is there's no perfect way to predict it. Even the smartest economist in the world can't predict it perfectly. They attempt to, and so we'll look at some ways to predict it, because that is why economists get paid six figures, is that we're paid to try to predict it. And so we're probably the best equipped to make an estimate, sometimes a guesstimate, but economists like weathermen and women aren't the best always at perfectly forecasting the weather. So weather and economics, they're kind of similar in the prediction business. Why? Because it's very complex. So if we think about the weather and the complexity of what's going on with the weather, there's even more complexity with the economy. And so it's very difficult to make those predictions. And so we learn afterwards ultimately. So have you guys heard about something like The Big Short? The movie The Big Short? So it's a little bit older, and it's not, I don't know if it was 2014, 2015, 16, 17, I can't remember, somewhere in that range, but it was based on a guy who did make a prediction that the housing market was overvalued, and he made billions by placing essentially a short position, which is in some cases a bet, so to speak, on the housing market. And so by doing that, he made billions. And that was kind of the nature of that movie. So yes, this stuff's very hard to predict, but we'll get into the issues related to that. These opening chapters are really here to help us define what we're trying to predict, right? So what is the definition of GDP? What's real GDP? What's inflation? What's unemployment? We're kind of getting all the variables defined is what we're doing in these opening chapters. Tim, did you have follow-up?
Yeah. Is there a reason why it's every 10 years?
No, there's not. And it's not every 10 years. So there's not a cycle. People have done it 1,000 times trying to figure it out. And there's nothing there. Jesse?
He asked my question.
Oh, that's what you were wondering too. Yeah. Yeah, so, people have kind of tried, there seems to be a pattern, and, there's all these really brilliant people that are, genius level types that have tried to do this. It can't be done. It's just not, there's too much unknowns to make a good prediction. Okay, so that is that. What's the other one I wanted to put up here? Here's the inflation figures. We'll kind of wrap up with this one for this chapter today. So the inflation rate over time, again, kind of goes up and down for reasons that we'll learn later of why it's doing that. But here, the government pursued some inflationary policy. You remember me doing the boop, 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 with printing off money, essentially, and kind of being a little excessive with spending, led to some historically high rates of inflation for the United States during this 1970 time frame. And then unfortunately, you guys just experienced the latest one, where again, the government was irresponsible with what they did with COVID money. Passing out money, $1,500 to everybody, trying to recover from the, shutting down the economy, whatever it was, they ended up doing some things that we're going to learn about in more detail that caused us to get back up to 10%. I didn't even think it would ever happen in my lifetime. I didn't think they were that stupid. It turns out they are. I've really kind of changed my mind. When I was teaching this class 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I kind of had some confidence in my fellow economists that were running the money supply. I don't anymore. I don't have the same level of confidence. I really can't believe that they allowed things to get that far out of whack, even in the face of COVID. And again, they'll say, well, it was justified, you don't understand. And part of the problem is that they put too much faith into these mathematical models that they think they've figured out the swings and how to better predict. And it turns out they're not as smart as they thought they were. So that is inflation over time. Now, notice we go through pretty long periods. So by the way, I guess somewhat, when I said I was, had faith in my fellow economists, this is to me doing a pretty good job. After we got through this mess, the late 80s, all the way up till COVID, notice we're kind of right in here, right? And so at different points in time, they've been more responsible than others. So why is this important? Well, people change their behavior based on anticipated inflation. So what we want to look at next here, that's kind of the wrap up to this, that'll tie into the rest of the course, is let's look at anticipated inflation. What does it mean to anticipate something? If you anticipate something, maybe you can think about your sports. Especially if you're playing something like football, soccer. What are you doing when you anticipate something? Yeah, and so you're making an expectation, right? So you're anticipating it, and so are you changing your behavior before that person actually makes that move with the ball? Whether it's the football, soccer ball, basketball, right? That's kind of what we're getting at here. So anticipating stuff. Anticipated inflation, then, is the inflation that is expected based on maybe previous history or otherwise, right? So anticipated inflation is the expected inflation given previous history and other information. And the key point to this, from an economic standpoint, is that decision makers are going to make a change today based on what they anticipate. So decision makers, which is everybody in a sense, but decision makers make choice today based on expected future inflation. Decision makers make a choice today based on expected future inflation. Let me give one example here. Banker deciding on a 5-year car loan to a customer. Should they do 6%? Should they do 7%? Right? So the interest rate, which we're going to use the symbol little I, the interest rate is the nominal amount charged. So let's call our customer somebody here, customer Tom. So Tom gets interest rate equal to 6% for 5 years. When the banker made that decision, they had to be thinking about inflation. If inflation was expected to be 10% per year, is this banker very smart? So the banker's going to loan out, let's just say it's the bank loan equals 30,000 bucks. So the banker's going to hand Tom 30,000 to go buy his new car. Tom's going to make back his payments at 6% interest for over a 5-year period. If inflation is actually expected to be, it's currently and expected to be 10% every year, is this banker very smart? No, right? So if the price is on, so think about what the banker's doing. The banker's giving up $30,000 today, and when Tom pays back his money at 6%, and the banker takes that first payment to Walmart, is he buying more goods with his earnings from Tom or less goods? If prices were 10%, Tom paid back at 6%. Was that a good investment? No, not in terms of the banker's purchasing power. So what must the banker at least get? How much?
10%.
10%. The banker has to get at least 10% just to break even, right? So 30,000 bucks, if the banker gives up 30,000 bucks and prices are going to go up by 10%, if he gets 10% from Tom and Tom pays him his 10% and the banker runs to Walmart, can he buy more stuff? No. You get it? So the banker has to have some inflation built into the rate. Has to take it into account, otherwise the banker's not very smart. And usually bankers have had some economics and some finance classes and they're a little bit smarter than that, right? So let's kind of put that down here. So note, if inflation is 10%, then banker will lose purchasing power. Purchasing power. I'll actually probably could do a little of this. Get that. The banker's actually going to lose purchasing power on the interest payments Tom makes. Lose purchasing power on the interest income payments. It's income to the banker. On the interest income from Tom. Therefore, the interest rate needs to be greater than or equal to 10% for the banker to at least break even on the loan. Yeah.
Would it make any more sense for a banker to, instead of using an interest rate, just change things that they do based off of the inflation rate at the time or at the future time?
Are you talking about a variable rate that changes each year?
Yeah.
Yeah, they can and do that. That's one way to hedge their bet. But a lot of times consumers don't like that, and so they'd rather have a fixed payment that they do. And so it's pretty common. This is one reason why What was biggie number 2 from yesterday? Biggie number 2.
Low and steady.
Low and stable. What? Have these memorized, you guys. Low and stable inflation. If we have low and stable inflation, it's easier for both Tom and the banker to make a deal, right? So this will make more efficiency with pricing, especially with long-term contracting in the economy. And so loans are just one place that's pretty important for inflation to be taken into account. So, so the key point here is the banker, I'm actually spilling a little bit into chapter 9, which is okay. The banker will make an interest rate, a little I, based upon what the expected inflation rate is, based on what he or she thinks the expected inflation will be, which we're going to use pretty quickly here. Expected inflation is pi superscript E for expected inflation. The banker will make an interest rate based upon what he or she thinks the expected inflation rate will be. And the real rate, little r, the real rate that he or she wants to earn. Okay, so let me go back to my example real quick here. If 10% was expected, and the banker knows that, hey, I want to earn 4% on my money in terms of real purchasing power. When I go to the store, and if I give you my hard-earned $30,000, I want to put 4% more stuff into my shopping cart when I go to Walmart. So if the real rate of return that the banker is requiring is 4%, how much should the banker charge Tom expecting that there's going to be 10% inflation? Tim, thank you, but I'm going to go back here. That's an awesome test question, something you need to know for this. So the banker's expecting inflation to be 10%. They want to earn a real rate of return of 4. What do they need to charge Tom? 14. Good. Caroline, how'd you get that?
Just added 4 to 10%.
4 and 10. So here's the key statement. If inflation actually is 10%, the banker would have lost purchasing power here, right? So the banker needs to charge at least 10 just to break even. Now, if the banker has determined, hey, I'm comfortable with a 4% increase in purchasing power, then I just add the two together. And so the Fisher formula, named after Irving Fisher, who's kind of an interesting character, like many brilliant geniuses, he came up with this little relationship for us that's real simple. He also invented ivory soap. And then he told all his, a lot of his colleagues and friends and family to put all their money in the stock market during the late 1920s because he had the stock market figured out. Super smart Irving, he's got it figured out. Guess what happened? What happened to the stock market in 1929? Everybody lost all their money. He went crazy. He started walking around the campus of Yale naked. That's the story of Irving Fisher. But before he went super bonkers, he gave us this nice formula here, is that the nominal rate of interest is equal, that the banker should charge, is equal to the real rate that they want to get, plus the expected level of inflation. So it's just adding the two together, just like we just did. So this is the nominal interest rate. The nominal rate, basically just think of that as what was charged to Tom, right? As far as Tom is concerned, that's the rate he has to pay back the banker. Where did the banker come up with that? Well, whether Tom knows it or not, the banker, being smart, said, well, I'm expecting there to be inflation rate, expected inflation of 10%, and I know I want to earn 4% on my money, so the little r here is the real rate of return, or the real interest rate, the real rate. Whenever we hear that word real, what's been taken into account? Opening question today, I think. Whenever we hear the word real, what's been taken into account? Inflation. So that's what we've done. Tom has taken inflation into account, or not Tom, the banker has taken inflation. I want to earn 4%. And so let's kind of do our example I just gave you. So example, if banker wants a real rate of 4% and the expected inflation rate is 10%, then banker must charge Tom an interest rate of 14%, as Carolyn came up with. Okay, questions on that? This is definitely, by the way, this is chapter 9 material, so I don't know if you want to note that or not, but that's our next topic coming in, so this just, we're right at the tail end and we're kind of just blending. This is the last thing here on chapter 8. Okay, cool with that? All right, so there's 2 ways to look at the Fisher formula though. This is what we call the ex ante approach. Ex ante is a Latin phrase that means before the fact. Before the fact. This is super important with decision making. One of my super smart PhD economics professors, when I was in the PhD program, I can almost picture Harvey LePan right now saying, you can't judge a decision ex post, only ex ante. What did he mean by that? So you can't judge a decision ex post. How many of you have made a decision and then it led to a bad outcome and you look backwards and you say, well, that was dumb. I made a dumb decision. Dr. LePan said you can't do that. That's not right. So you've heard of hindsight's 20/20? So when's the appropriate time to judge whether you made a good decision or not is before you learned about the things happening. It might have been a dumb move if you didn't do enough research. Oh, I could have searched the reviews, but I didn't. We were in a hurry or whatever, right? So yes, maybe it was a bad decision because you didn't gather enough information and you're kind of kicking yourself later. But a lot of times in life, you come to a point where you don't know how it's going to turn out, and there's no way to predict how it's going to turn out. You with me? You get to the point where, oh, I don't know, I'm a little scared. I'm going to go for it, right? You're going to go for it, and then if it turns out to be a bad outcome, you still made a great decision. You were just unlucky, right? It didn't pan out the way it does, but the probability of it being a good outcome, let's say, was 60% of getting the desired outcome, and 40% getting the bad outcome, and you went for it, and you kind of weighed out all the things, you just kind of gambled and lost in a sense. But I don't like to think of it as gambling as much because you made an informed decision, right? So we want you to be able to make good decisions ex ante before the fact. And so we need to gather some good information on what's going on with this expectation of how things will change as we go through time. But that doesn't stop us from being able to use the Fisher formula ex post. So note, ex post, after the fact. Ex post, we can analyze what happened and what the actual R was. Okay, so we anticipated 10%, but inevitably we're probably going to be wrong. And so this brings up the second part. Now I'm kind of flipping back to chapter 8, but this all kind of weaves together anyway, is unanticipated inflation. So unanticipated inflation. Unanticipated inflation is simply inflation that was not expected. And maybe we'll put on here by decision makers. So back to our example then with this unanticipated inflation. So for example, what if the actual inflation rate was equal to 14% instead of what was expected of 10? So ex post, we go through time and we learn that inflation was actually, I said 14, I kind of meant to say 12. Let me put 12. Sorry, let me edit that. In my brain I was thinking 12 and then I think I went to 14. So if the actual inflation rate was 12%, we were expecting 10. Is banker happy or sad? Sad, right? So let's use the Fisher formula ex post. So the ex post Fisher formula is that the interest rate is equal to the real rate plus the actual inflation rate. And so we contracted this, right? This is what we contracted. And then we learned that this was the actual rate. And so what was this again in our example with Tom the banker? What was it?
4%? Wait, no, wrong.
What was this when we contracted the car loan with Tom? 14. So this was 14, right? This was the contract loan amount. What was this?
10%.
What did it turn out to be? The actual, this act, I don't know if I put act, actual act. What was the actual inflation rate? 12. So ex post, after the fact, we learned this is 12%. So actual inflation rate. And so how much did the banker actually earn? 2%. So now we can use a little bit of math here and figure out what the banker earned. So the actual ex post, after the fact, if we do a little math here, the real rate is equal to the interest rate minus the actual inflation rate. And you guys did this already. The 14% minus the 12% gives us a 2% actual ex post rate of return. The banker made the deal expecting to get a real return of 4 and is not happy with the government's actions that drove the inflation rate higher than what was expected, what their goal was. Now, who's happy in this situation? The banker's not happy. We already identified that.
The loan
Nope.
taker?
Yeah, Tom. Tom is pretty happy. So, key points. Banker is pissed. Why? Because the expected return is less than what actually happened. What actually happened was 2%. The expected rate was 4%. Tom, our borrower, is happy for the same reason. Tom was expecting to pay a real rate, of 4%, but only paid 2%. Yeah.
I don't quite get that because in theory Tom pays the same amount, 12%.
Tom pays the same nominal amount.
Okay, so because the buy part is something different, we
Yep,
expect
but
this-
he's buying back. He's paying back his loan in cheaper dollars now. Yeah. So that's a good point. Remember, I'll put that as an extra note. Remember, Tom always pays the nominal interest rate of 14%. It's just the inflation worked to his advantage, not the banker's advantage. So the thing I'll close on with this is that there's an inefficiency here. This is why we want low stable inflation. So key point number 2. we want low and stable inflation so that loan transactions can be more efficient. Efficient, and what we mean by that in this context, lower interest rates. If the banker has unstable predictions about what inflation could be 10, could be 2, could be 8, what would they tend to favor? A higher inflation rate or a lower when they're making loans? What do you think? Fernando? I like your direction of your hand there. Yeah. The banker's going to have to predict, or expect rather, a higher rate rather than a lower rate, which means Tom's going to pay higher interest rather than lower interest, right? So that's the stable part. It'd be better to have that inflation rate be pretty much locked in and stable in terms of having a more active and reliable, efficient loan market. Okay, any last questions or comments there? All right, well that ended up being, I'd say even the majority of that was really related to our next chapter coming up here. Chapter 9. So chapter 9. This is kind of the granddaddy, the start of the big markets here. So macro markets. So chapter 9, I would call it the granddaddy of macro model building. So now we're exiting the defining things, unemployment, inflation, real GDP, and we're moving into predicting what's going to happen to the economy through building this macro economy. And so let me just put another note here. Note Fisher formula is chapter 9. So all the stuff I mentioned about this whole Fisher formula business, that's really all chapter 9 stuff. Okay, so we're going to look at kind of 4 major markets and really kind of 5, but major markets for this chapter. So major markets to consider for our economic agents. Secret agent man. Major markets to consider. So our kind of major market participants that we've been working on are households, businesses, and the government. So we've been spending some time the last few days looking at the circular flow diagram, the goods market, the output market, and the exchanges that these economic agents in the macro world are going to be doing. So I'm going to kind of give you a thumbnail sketch of the big picture here. All right, so we're going to have the resource market. So here's going to be the resource market in general. And so one of those resources would be like labor. But we could put machines and capital and other things. And so in general, we have a demand and a supply of resources. So now this is chapter 3 looking, right? Except we're kind of talking about the resources for the United States. So it's kind of this big, higher level look at things. So the supply and demand for resources, the demand, remember, is our businesses. They're the ones that want to hire resources, and the owners of those resources are the households. So in terms of bringing our economic agents together, we can primarily look at this, and again, as we saw before, the government's going to play a role in this as well, because they need somebody to clean the toilet at the White House and buy toilet paper and stuff. But primarily, we can kind of think about businesses and households here. And so from there, we can determine a wage. So we might have some sort of wages being measured here. All right, so that's kind of the labor market. The next one I want to put up is the loanable funds market. Loanable funds. So this is the banking industry for the most part, but it involves insurance companies and other major players in the marketplace. And so again, there'll be a supply and demand for loanable funds. The supply of funds is coming from our household and other people, but they're kind of our primary saver. Household savers. And the demand curve primarily, again, would be business borrowers. So they're going to make deals with banks and other financial institutions to borrow some funds. What they're thinking about, and this is where it's kind of nice we spent time on this already, is the real rate of interest, which is the interest rate minus the expected inflation rate. So interest rates are being measured here on the vertical axis. So when the two get together, we end up getting some loans going on maybe at the real rate of interest of 6%. And we get an amount of loanable funds at $375 billion. And we get this many people working, and this is the amount of labor hours being worked. And the average wage is at $20 an hour. All right, so we'll pick up there. There's a couple more to go, but we're going to build on that framework